Here is Romans chapter 12 verses 1 to 3 from the New International Version reads. 1 Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. 2 Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. 3 For by the grace given me I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. Expounding on these verses. Verse 1, Living sacrifices to God. This verse urges Christians to present themselves as living sacrifices to God. Unlike the animal sacrifices of the Old Testament, this is a metaphorical concept, referring to a life lived in service and obedience to God. It signifies a total commitment, where one's life is dedicated to God's service, embodying holiness and pleasing to God. This act is described as spiritual worship, indicating that worship is not just about rituals or ceremonies, but also about how one lives their life. Verse 2, Transformation and renewal. This verse contrasts conforming to the world with being transformed by the renewal of the mind. The world here represents the values, practices, and principles that are contrary to God's will. The verse calls for a transformation, which is a fundamental change in character and outlook, brought about by the renewal of the mind. This implies a deep, internal change that affects how one perceives and understands God's will, leading to discernment of what is good, pleasing, and perfect in God's sight. Verse 3, Humility and faith. Paul emphasizes humility in this verse, warning against an inflated sense of self-importance. He encourages believers to view themselves with sober judgment, which means having a realistic understanding of oneself in relation to God and others. This understanding is to be based on the measure of faith God has given each individual. The mention of faith here suggests that our understanding of ourselves and our capabilities should be rooted in our relationship with God, recognizing that our abilities and roles in the church and the world come from Him. In summary, Romans chapter 12 verses 1 to 3 is a call for a holistic worship of God, encompassing a dedicated life, transformation of character and mind, and a humble and realistic understanding of oneself in the context of faith. This passage serves as a guide for how Christians are to live in response to the mercy of God.